Head over to the Facebooks to share. Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the altar. I am your host, Colby Martin. It'd be really fun, though, if sometime there was a different host in the altar. I should try that out. I should try bringing in someone else to host the show. I don't know why I would do that. These things come to me in the moment, and I don't stop to filter them. I just say them. Welcome to the altar, everyone. Good afternoon, if it's afternoon where you're at. Good evening. Good morning. I don't know how many people watch more west of me. I keep waiting for that Hawaii crowd to wake up and join me. But welcome to the altar. On today's show, I'm going to continue my series called Makers in March. This is where all month long I'll be inviting people onto the show who are making really cool things in the world. And my buddy Brandan Robertson makes a ton of stuff. And so he's got a new book out called To Be Emptied, which I can't wait to talk to him about. But he also makes a lot of other fantastic things, and we haven't caught up in a while. So I thought, hey, come on to the show, Brandan. We'll catch up in real time and allow other people to listen and ask questions and be a part of the show if they want. Anyway, glad you're here with me. I'm not going to do much more of a cold open. I'm going to get into the show. Welcome to the altar. Oh, we went right to this scene. I wasn't Brandan, I guess we're on this scene. Why did it go there? Oh, my machine's all messed up. 1 second, everyone. That was a surprise. I caught everyone off guard. Okay. That's weird. Okay. I need to alert Ecamm that when I go to that scene, it goes to that. All right. It's whatever. Like I tell my guests, when we're live, everything's jive. And so sometimes that happens. I wasn't quite ready to bring Brandan on. I was not quite ready. So sorry about that, Brandan, for putting you on a weird spot. Hey, everyone. Welcome. I do have some mornings. Like, look at this. Dave Crothers says morning here. Dave, remind me where you're watching from. I feel like maybe you've told me before, but I'm glad you're here because there's 2 mornings. Wow. This is exciting. We've covered the entire day. Good day. Oh yeah, Dave, that's right. Was it Australia or New Zealand? That's where I think that's where you're coming from. Hi, Mercy. Glad you're here. Thanks for hanging out with me this afternoon. Well, for you, maybe no, not quite evening. Gustavo, wait, what did I say that you don't want? I don't recall. I'm sure it was something. And hi, Susan. Good to have you here. Yes, that's right. Melbourne, Australia. Dave, glad you're here with us. I'm going to get to my guest here in just a second. I won't waste too much more of anybody's time. Not that it's a waste of time when we're together. Oh, Gustavo, maybe it's when I said have another person come host the show. Maybe that's what you said no to. Don't worry, it wasn't really going to happen. Hey, John, good to have you here. Thanks for hanging out with us this afternoon. Welcome from Canada. Everyone else, feel free to let me know where. I'd love to know where you're coming from. Ben, it's been a minute, buddy. It's good to see you. And what is that? Like a lizard? Is that a lizard in your profile picture? Or a gecko? I don't know. I'm not up to date on my reptile thumbnails. Hello, Horatio. Good evening from the UK. See, we've got morning, we've got daytime, we've got evening, we've got all of March 9th and some of March 10th covered here. Yes, Gustavo, I finally figured it out. Be our host forever. I will until I'm not, but I will. Catmandu. Oh, just kidding. I'm like, Vince, is that true? No, it's not. He's just kidding. Bearded Dragon. Oh, man, and he just passed away. I'm sorry. What was his name? Ben? How long did you have him? We've got Angelo coming in hot from NYC, Northern Yorkshire County, I believe is what that stands for. How are you today? Not you specifically, Angelo, although you can answer. How are all of you doing on this day? Quick story for you. I went to the post office. I'm actually told a version of this story a couple weeks ago at our church. I went to the post office like 3 weeks ago to mail a bunch of puzzles to people in our church. It's a different story for a different day. And I had noticed that up to that point, for the couple weeks before that, as you know, the pandemic had obviously been going on for a really long time, and some of the mask mandates have gotten a little bit fuzzy and unclear, and I've been noticing that I occasionally will run into a store and not have a mask on and not really think about it and just forget it, and sometimes it's not in my car. So I told a story a couple weeks ago of going into a post office and almost like I got to the door with all these boxes in my hand, and then I saw the big sign out there, masks required. And I'm like, oh crap, all right. Even though I've run into Starbucks lately to grab something or run into Albertsons and not had a mask, I'm going to be in the post office for more than a hot second, and they have the sign, masks required. Let me run back to my car and rummage through the bottom and find a dirty mask to wear, to throw on my face. And so I'm in the post office, getting these packages all addressed and whatnot. And after a few minutes, I noticed somebody come walking in who doesn't have a mask on. And instantly, my mind went to a place of judgment. Instantly, I'm like, oh, you freaking science denying, Trump supporting, indifferent to the suffering of others jerk. Like that was like just so quick. My mind went there. And fortunately, I guess the gap between when I went hyper judgmental and when I caught myself was like pretty quick. And yet to the point where I'm like, oh my God, Colby, that not only was that almost you just a few minutes ago, but that has been you a couple times over the last few weeks, where you run into a place really quick and you don't have a mask on and you don't view yourself in all these judgmental ways that you just loaded onto that stranger without even knowing. Anyway, so I told that story at our church a couple weeks ago. I went to the post office again yesterday, and I thought, because now California has like lifted all of its indoor mask mandates. In fact, we're even next week, schools are now not requiring it anymore. So in my mind, there's like, oh, I don't need to worry about masks anymore. And I get to the post office and I come in with my boxes and I start setting up, and another guy comes in without a mask on, and I hear the workers like say, sir, we need you to put a mask on because it's a federal building and so masks are still required. So I didn't realize that. Didn't realize that. Our guest today might be able to explain that one to me because he lives like in a federal world now. So I guess the post office as a federal building still has mask mandate. So I like lumbered back into the lobby area because I didn't have a mask with me. Lumbered back into the lobby area, snuck in really quick and grabbed one of their free masks and did the rest of my work like outside. Anyway, why do I tell you that story? Because this is just still a weird world that we live in. and I don't always know the best way to conduct myself, and I don't know that I always do it right. But I am excited for our kids, as next week the schools are no longer requiring masks. I imagine some kids still will, just like some adults when they go into stores still wear them, and there's all sorts of reasons for why that is. But a lot of kids perhaps don't feel great wearing masks. And why do I say all that? I don't know, friends. I just felt like asking you how you were doing, and that was the thing that came to my mind about how I'm doing. Hi, Fred. Good to see you here, bud. It's been a minute. Yes. Glad you're here. It was Jeff. Ben, your bearded dragon was 5 years old, named Jeff. Sorry for your loss, man. Shane says you're doing all right. Just finished dinner. Oh yeah, that's right, because it's evening time for you. It was snowing in New York last week. Good gravy, Shane. It is not snowing here. It is sunny and like 75. Not to rub it in, Brandon. I know you you miss those. Or maybe you don't miss it. I'm excited to find out, because our guest today used to live out here in San Diego and now doesn't. And I'm wondering if he misses the sun at all. Vince, thanks for sharing this. I like wearing masks, Vince says. I'm introverted and quiet. It makes me feel more protected in public, and I don't need to show my face. If you're an introvert, you'll understand. I love that perspective. Thanks for sharing. It does. It kind of keeps you a little bit like in my zone. Yeah. Liv says we've had anti-mandate protesters camping on our parliament lawn for 24 days and causing absolute drama. Glad they're gone now. Yeah. Interesting. Related but unrelated to that, Liv. My oldest son does like a hybrid college high school program. And so he has high school classes on a college campus, and then also takes some college classes as well. And the other day I was driving him there in the morning, and the college campus had just reopened after a period of time. And he was telling me about how the day before there was a bunch of protesters at the community college area that were out there protesting mask mandates. And my son was talking about him and his classmates were reflecting on how absurd that was and how ridiculous it is to show up and to protest somewhere and to protest and be mad about mask mandates. Like, come on, do something better with your life. And I guess I took that little bit of an opportunity there to remind my oldest child that he and we as a family have also been a part of protests in various forms and at various places. And surely there are individuals that have driven by us or walked by us and had the same thought, how ridiculous and absurd that is that they're out there protesting. And my son was like, oh yeah, I guess I sort of just by default put myself in the camp of the right, being on the right side of this issue by default, and the protesters as the wrong ones. I guess I should slow down and maybe, yeah, that is how often we think that the things that we protest are the right things, but then when other people do it, it's the wrong things, and how quickly we are always on the right side. Conveniently, we're always on the right side of all the issues in our own story. It doesn't always work that way, probably. Yes, Susan, there's another great perspective. Continue wearing masks because of health issues. Absolutely. That all belongs. Hi, Odette. Good to have you. Glad you're here. I don't know what you're same hearing, but sometimes I don't look at the comments in time, and then the moment passes and I don't know what y'all are referring to. Okay. I want to get right to our guest because I have a lot of things to catch up with him about and a lot of what I think are interesting things to talk about. And so without any more ado than I've already done, and now I hope it's going to go to the correct scene because earlier it went to the wrong scene. But let's welcome to the show, everybody, my buddy Brandan Robertson. That's the scene we want. Hi, Brandan.
Hey there. How's it going?
It's going well. You heard a little bit how it's going. I'm kind of erratic and sporadic and trying to figure out, do I need to wear masks in the post office? And turns out I do. Can you explain that to me since you're a DC man now?
Yeah, no, I can't. I worked for the mayor of DC for the past 6 months, and I still can't figure out when we're supposed to wear masks here. So
confusing. Man, thanks for being here on the show. You're actually No, I was going to say you're my first returning guest. I think I've had one other returning guest, but you're one of a small list of people who have now appeared on the altar twice. Although I think back when you came the first time, it was under a different name. I think back then I was still calling it Perspective Shift. I don't remember, but doesn't matter. Say it's still me behind this camera and microphone. And thanks for coming back, man. Let's start here.
It's good to be in conversation with you.
It is, isn't it? Well, I mean, I guess I shouldn't take that for granted. It's good to be in conversation with you. I don't know if it's always true for people to be in conversation with me. I referenced earlier how gorgeous it is here. And I'm just wondering now, maybe we'll start here. Update me and us on where you're living and why. Where are you now? You're in DC. Yeah. Why are you there? What are you doing? And do you miss here in San Diego?
Totally. Yeah. So right now I'm in DC. I've been here for a year and coming up on a year and a half. I won't be in DC for very much longer, perhaps.
Oh, really?
Okay. I can't say too much more about that at this point, but big moves in the future, hopefully. Okay. But right now in DC, I've kind of spent the last year and a half looking at what it looks like to do faith community in a digital space. And so my day job right now, I get to work for a great organization called Interfaith Youth Corps. I do digital work for them and then spend a lot of time cultivating a digital faith community called Metanoia. And just really exploring what post-COVID progressive Christian world might look like.
What's this? What's the one Interfaith Youth? What's that? Say it again.
Interfaith Youth Corps.
Okay.
It's Chicago-based.
What do they do?
Chicago-based nonprofit. It's the largest interfaith organization in the country that has primarily been working with college campuses to educate kids from all different kinds of faiths about how they can utilize their faith as a tool for leadership and also build bridges across the growing pluralistic reality that we live in. And so it's a really fun place to be. Lots of amazing colleagues from all different kinds of religious worlds. And so, it's a great place to learn and to get to contribute and create with them.
That's cool. And what do you do for them?
Right. I'm directing digital media. So I'm a social media manager there. And get to spend my day playing around basically with the amazing programs and events that we're putting on and figuring out how to create interfaith community in social media spaces.
I love that. Are you still there was a church there that you were doing like I forget what the title was. Are you still at that church doing that role or what's the story there?
I was at that church for exactly 4 weeks. And I mean, this COVID has been a crazy season of life, right? I took a part-time minister job at a church, Episcopal church here in DC, an incredible community. And then 4 weeks in, I got a full-time job offer, which I thought was going to be a dream job for the next season of life, getting into government and politics. And quickly learned after 6 months of that is not the world I want to be in, and have been really pivoting back into this faith space.
So. Okay. Can you say anything about what you learned in that revealed to you why that isn't maybe where you want to be right now?
Yeah. I think the political world usually, if you're doing local politics, I really believe that you can make positive change in the world. I feel like normally mayors and people, activists and organizers working at a local level can do a lot of good. The thing with DC is because we are a local government. I was a mayor here, but we're also a federal city. And so the political world runs a little bit of both of those things. And it was just 24/7, right? I was literally on the clock until 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning. Sometimes I was working 7 days a week. And that speed of politics is not something that I see in my life. I really want to have balance. I want to be able to do other things. And so for me, it was really a personal, I'm not interested in giving my life to the game of politics if it's not tangibly making impacts. And I also feel like my gifts and calling are towards other things. And so
all right.
Stepped out of that pretty quickly.
Okay. Thanks for sharing that. Let's talk about some of those gifts and callings. So I'm doing this series here in the altar called Makers in March. And one of the things one of my favorite things about humans is that we are able to observe the world around us, identify matter and material and concepts, see what already is, and then imagine what is not yet, but what could be if only we rearranged some of the existing matter and concepts and ideas. Because there's nothing new under the sun. And that is true both like all the energy that ever was, like energy cannot be destroyed or created. So everything was always here. And even ideas and beliefs, like, the great author of Ecclesiastes says, there's really nothing new. Like we're all circling the same sun, both theologically and philosophically. We're just finding different packaging for it. But what I love about humans is we look at what is and what could be, and we create things that were not before we created them. And these, in my mind, is like just what a maker is. A maker is like, there wasn't this thing, and now if I arrange these things in a particular way, now there is a thing. And I find that endlessly fascinating. And you make and have made a lot of things. And so you talked about getting back into your gifts and calling. And I wonder if maybe we can start by talking about some of what you have made in the world of TikTok, which is this platform that I don't know really anything about. I've stayed away from it because it overwhelms and scares me. I'm like, I already want to get off of all the other platforms. I don't know if I want to add one more thing, but I have seen you look into the world of the TikTok and have seen, hey, there is possibility to make things here. So tell me a little bit about what you've made there and how you think and feel about that.
Totally. Yeah, TikTok was completely accidental. I stumbled into it really while I was pastoring in San Diego, right when the COVID pandemic started. I had seen some of my clergy colleagues in San Diego posting like these funny little videos of them dressing in colorful clergy collars and dancing around and stuff like that. And I was like, I'm never going to get into
Pass.
And then one day I was sitting in my office, and I mean, it was a little bit into the pandemic, and I decided to do exactly what I've always felt called to do, which was to talk to people about big ideas around theology, about God, spirituality. I knew I wasn't going to do very well if I tried to dance or mimic all these other kinds of content I was seeing. So I literally set up a tripod in my office and did a 1-minute clip about, I forget which topic it was, but something like, who is Jesus, or what does the cross mean, or one of these things, but from a progressive Christian perspective. And I did a few of those videos and kind of let it sit. And when I logged back into TikTok, I had something, it was like 5,000 people had started following after a couple of those videos, which really piqued my interest because TikTok is usually engaged with by the younger generation, so to speak, if I can say that now, Gen Z. And they were really interested in these kind of nerdy theological conversations. And so I started making more content, and the amount of engagement on TikTok was more than I had ever seen on any of my other social media platforms. Wow. And within 6 months of engaging, it was up to like 50,000 people following. And I was like blown away by this. And so anyways, a year and a half later, I think I'm a year and a half into this, and I've been doing TikTok probably every week, a couple times a week, creating new content, these 1-minute to 3-minute videos. And a community grew out of that. Part of what helped me to step away from pastoring a brick and mortar congregation in San Diego was I realized that this community wanted to move not only together on this app, but they were willing to move off the app and come into like Zoom conversations where we could have long form discussions and do spiritual practices with one another and do Bible study. And so that led me into where I'm at today, which is still utilizing TikTok as a way to begin conversations with another generation, but also moving those folks off to what we're calling Metanoia Church. It's this cool community of a couple hundred people from TikTok that meet 2 Sundays a month, and we get together and do progressive Christian church. And so, yeah, TikTok is really this great outlet for me to get to nerd out, do what I love to do, talk about what I love to talk about, and continue to live into this pastoral calling, even if I don't have a traditional church to do it in.
So you started making these videos, and people started paying attention and following and interacting and engaging. And you thought to yourself, what if I keep making things, and what if I made space for these people to come together in a kind of church way? Is this correct?
Yeah.
Okay, so what is this
Yeah.
thing? What are you doing? What is this church thing?
Yeah. I mean, it's comments. I'll go back here for a second. I'm sure you hear this too. Those of us in this progressive Christian space speaking about these things, I kept seeing people say things like, if you were my pastor growing up, I would still be a Christian, or I'm interested at coming back to Jesus. Like I never thought I would. I'm an
Yeah.
atheist and agnostic,
Yeah.
but you're making me reconsider this. And that stuff, like that blew my mind. That again, just having an honest conversation about faith was bringing people back, quote unquote, to Jesus. And so that is what piqued my interest to say, well, these people still won't enter into a church building. Most of the people I interact with on TikTok still aren't really comfortable or interested in going into an institution of organized
Yeah.
religion. But we've all become accustomed to living digitally and living in Zoom spaces. And so for a year, I really kind of teased it on TikTok last year about like, what if we started meeting? What if? And the interest continued to grow. And so January, the first Sunday in January, we launched a Zoom Sunday service. And I was blown away. We had 450 people sign up for that first service, which was way more than I ever had in my sanctuary.
Wow, did you have to upgrade your Zoom account? Oh, gotta go to
I did, and
professional
Zoom is
account.
so it's so expensive. Anyways, I won't get on Zoom on that, but we did, and ever since then we've continued to cultivate this community, and I'm really excited to see like what the limits of this are. Where can this go? Where can these virtual communities, like the one you're cultivating right here, like this is for somebody the place where they're connecting with community and spirituality, and how do we integrate faith and this virtual reality going forward? I'm really interested in that conversation, and yeah, I'm interested in making things in this space for years to come, hopefully.
So what are give me an example of like what a typical, you said it's every other Sunday? Is that right? So what does a typical service look like? What is a person, what would should they expect if they wanted to join Metanoia?
Yeah. Well, I've changed it every week, right?
Okay.
First week, try to do a traditional church service, and we have music playing on a video, and that stuff just doesn't work in digital spaces quite as well unless it's live. And I'm not a live musician, so I could not help us out there. Right now, really, it's people come in. We have a time of prayer and meditation. So we probably spend 15, 20 minutes, people naming kind of things that are on their hearts. And we kind of have a traditional prayer that we do with that. And then we have about 10 minutes.
Sorry to interrupt. Is this so this is still on Zoom? Is that still the platform you're using? So is everybody's screen on and microphone on? Like how do you facilitate? I can't imagine it's 400 people every week because there's always some attrition with new things, but even whatever people do, how do you handle basically what I'm saying is I can't be overly bored by you sharing more logistics about it. I'm interested in that. Yeah. So tell me I'd log on, I got my camera on, I got my microphone on maybe, or a mute. Yeah.
I mean, it's a real mix. So you're right. Every week the numbers really have fluctuated dramatically, and that's fine. And yeah, people show up with their video on. Some people don't ever turn their video on. A lot of the people I've found out are people that are like conservative Christians and are skeptical about what's happening, but they're listening into the service.
Really? Like some Nicodemus action going on.
Yeah. Or like, I feel like a lot of folks come in thinking they're going to be heresy hunters, and then they're actually kind of blown away at how Jesus-y the gathering is. If that's my perspective on it, at least.
You always surprise people with that. It's always like people think they're going to find, and all they find with Brandan is just a lot more Jesus than they'd ever expect.
I try. Yeah. I mean,
and I like that about you. That's a compliment. I like that about you. You throw people for loops when they don't see that coming with you.
Well, thank you. Yeah. And I mean, so anyways, people come in, cameras are on, some cameras are not. And I kind of do what you just did. I open up, say hi to people as they're coming in. It's very important in normal church and in virtual church that people feel acknowledged. And so I've worked really hard to try to make sure that I'm naming people and saying hi to people and inviting people into conversation. So it's not the Brandan show, but that this is an actual community. And then after the prayer and meditation, I then talk for maybe 10 or 15 minutes about a passage, an idea, something. And then we go into breakout groups. People spend about 15 minutes discussing whatever I just said in breakout groups. We come back for probably 20 to 30 minutes and do a full group conversation.
Oh, wow.
And then after that, we say, go in peace. And it really is just a safe space for people to come and discuss the things that you can't discuss in normal church settings. And now people have taken initiative in small groups, and so their small groups meet throughout the week. There's new programming that people are taking the initiative and creating, and so in a very real sense, it's becoming the same kind of church community I was pastoring, again, in a brick and mortar setting,
Yeah.
but people connected from all around the world. And so it's really, I'm excited to see where this goes, and I'm also very aware that as much as I think the digital moment is our future, I think we're moving more into this space. I don't know that like these digital spaces are where people will always want their spirituality to be centered. And so it's super experimental. I'm not attached to it. And I'm trying to ask this community to work with me to create whatever kind of space needs to be created to help people reconnect to spirituality and feel grounded in this most turbulent moment of human history.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm conscious of the unique perspective that you bring to this, because you were in a brick and mortar church before the pandemic. Then you did it for a while during the pandemic. And then you left brick and mortar church, were out of the church game for a bit, in the loosest sense, or maybe the strictest sense of the word, I guess. And now you're back in a entirely digital. So I think you have a unique perspective on it. Because it's an interesting time right now. You and I both have colleagues and peers whose churches didn't survive the pandemic. And by that, I just mean they ran out of funding, or they just couldn't do it anymore for whatever reason. We have colleagues, peers, friends that have left the ministry during these last 2 years for all sorts of reasons, not least of which is it's just really freaking hard to be a pastor. End of sentence, new sentence. And then when you add other variables onto it, like like a pandemic and trying to do things virtually. And then there was that brief window of time, like last fall, where we thought the pandemic was kind of over, and, Trident Gum was doing commercials, inviting everybody to go outside and kiss strangers. And so we thought the thing was over, and we went back to in-person church, but it was also kind of like this weird hybrid of people still wearing masks and keeping distance and still trying to keep a virtual while doing in person. And that had, I don't know, mixed success. And then at least out here in California, we had sort of the winter Omicron surge, which kind of forced everybody to go back indoors for a bit. And it's just, I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on, like, do you ever put the futurist hat on and kind of have a sense, like the people that show up to Metanoia, do you get the feeling that some of them are waiting for an opportunity to go back to a brick and mortar? Or do you think that might be a thing they might never do again?
Yeah. I mean, on one sense, I think just the broader sense of this pandemic and the reality we've been experiencing, I do think the train is kind of leaving the station. The pandemic, as we've known it for the past 2 years, I think from a policy perspective, just hearing what's going on in DC here, I think brick and mortar is going to be coming back, at least as an option, and it's probably going to stay back for the foreseeable future for the next couple years. And so I think we're in the moment of experiment to see whether people still want to connect in digital space. I think a lot of people are just more comfortable now. It is so much more comfortable to be able to sit in my home, also have real relationship and have real connection and get real nourishment than it is. I mean, even like last year when I was out of the church game, I live on the block of an incredible church, 2 churches right out my door within a block that I could be a part of. And I still attended those churches online when I was not going to church. And so it was like, I think that's going to be the reality for a lot of people. But I also do think realistically that this digital moment is going to wind down a bit. I think as we get back to quote unquote normal life, there is something about personal connection that we all know can't be replicated in this space. And so I do think like Metanoia itself as a community is probably going to get smaller over the next 6 months as people do find things to do on Sunday morning with people in the flesh. So,
Brandan, real quick, Cheryl asks how people can check out your online church. So do you have a URL that I can throw on the screen?
Yeah, it's metanoiacenter.org.
Metanoiacenter.org.
Yeah.
All right. I'm going to throw that on the screen just for a minute there, Cheryl. Put it right on top of Brandan. All right. Go check that out, everyone. Okay, let's transition then. Thanks for sharing all that. Let's transition to, you just had a book come out. Speaking of makers, you've made a lot of books, brother. Is this like your 6th published book now?
This is 7, yeah.
This is 7. Okay, sorry. I got to give you all because you're like what, 22 years old? Yes. You've made a lot of books, and I'm always both astonished and also like, oh yeah, you're a fellow type Enneagram 3, so of course you're just cranking things out at a pace that's unrealistic and unsustainable for most people. But yay, go us! We'll survive somehow. But this one is called "Filled to Be Emptied," and I'd love to talk about some of the things that you raise in this book. But first, for those who don't yet know about this book, give us like give us the pitch, give us the elevator. What is this book about, and why would someone want to check it out?
Yeah, well, this book was a result simply of pastoring during the pandemic, being at my church in San Diego, and I stepped into being the pastor of the community like 3 months before Donald Trump became president. And the entirety of my tenure as the pastor there was constantly facing the new crisis that was emerging in our country, whether it was the Women's March and talking about sexual abuse, and or Black Lives Matter and the murder of George Floyd, or the pandemic. Like, there was never a break over those 4 years.
Yeah. It was a whirlwind, wasn't it? Oof.
Yeah. And so that changed my preaching, that changed my teaching, that changed my emphasis, as it did for all of us who were pastoring in those times. And the one thing that happened while I was pastoring was this word privilege started coming up a lot in our conversation. And I noticed that even I felt really uncomfortable with the language and like the conversation, even though I'm pretty plugged in. Like, both you and I are, and many people probably watching are pretty plugged into the progressive world, and like this stuff was bubbling up, and I noticed my own discomfort about it. And then I noticed in my community that people didn't really want to talk about, or didn't know how to talk about, white privilege, Christian privilege, straight privilege, whatever it might be. And so I went and I searched the Bible and tried to find a hook in the scripture that I could use to help break down the concept of privilege to a group of people that were familiar with the Bible, and came to Philippians chapter 2, which has been one of my favorite scripture passages forever. And in that verse, it says, Jesus, being in the form of God, does not consider equality with God something to be exploited for his own benefit, but he gives it up. And when those words in the translation I was looking at did not exploit it for his own benefit, they jumped off the page to me when I was thinking about privilege. And I was like, that is white privilege, right? It's about having white privilege, but not using it to protect your whiteness and to protect your status and your power, but rather giving it up for the good of others. Like, that is precisely what we're being asked to do by communities of color. This is precisely what the LGBT community is asking heterosexual people to do. Recognize you have power and privilege, and choose not to use it for your own benefit, but give it up for others. Anyways, turn that into a sermon series. I think for 6 weeks preached on that. It worked for our community. And so I wanted to see what I could do about turning it into a book, and hopefully using it for progressive mainline communities that were also a little sketched out by the privilege conversation, to have an easy access point that uses language of faith and Bible and all of that to help us articulate and understand what privilege and bias and all these things are.
Yeah. Let's talk for a minute about that word privilege, because I think it's on some level, it might have so quickly in our public discourse moved from what is that term? It just means that things are easy for me. It so quickly moved from like a new concept to almost like this background noise of assumption. Oh yeah, we all know what we're talking about here when we talk about privilege, that I think a lot of us might have missed actually grasping a working and workable definition or description, maybe is a better word, because maybe it's one of those where it's really hard to define, but you can describe it. So for those of us who might have moved so quickly from what is that to, oh yeah, no, I totally get it, and it's just in the background now and I don't really think about it. Give us sort of how you in the book describe what this concept of privilege is.
Yeah. I mean, the first thing to note is that privilege is not a bad thing. It's a morally neutral thing. Privilege is a reality.
Okay.
And so anywhere that any society that has ever existed, there's a group of people who creates that society. There's a group of people who creates the systems and structures of a society. And that group usually acts in its own interest. Again, that's not a good or bad thing. It can be good and it can be bad. And so in our country, for instance, how I talk about in the book, white, European, cisgender men they were landowning men, so usually quite wealthy, quite affluent. They're the ones who come over from Europe and establish the United States. And so these people come together and they're the ones who have this divine dictate from the Pope to be able to come over and colonize and slaughter people. But they're also the people that come over and start drafting documents and thinking about what our government looks like. And again, that story is complicated and that story has good and bad in it. I think we can all agree. But I don't think the founders of our country set out, I won't say it that way. We'll just say, as they started to draft documents and create the systems and structures of our society, they did it in a way that privileged people like them and marginalized people that weren't like them. And as our society has grown and evolved since the days of that founding, those principles of who was privileged in our founding documents and founding institutions and those who were marginalized have continued, and the marginalization gap has continued to grow. And so we come to this moment of history that we're in, where 200 and something years into the American experiment, white cisgender men hold the most privilege and power in our society. And you can look around and see this in political office. You can see it in religious institutions. You can see it in social institutions and in entertainment. And those who are not that have continued to grow in disparity. There are less people, there are less opportunities, there's less path forward if you're not a white cisgender man to get forward in our society. And so the question we need to start asking, and this is what people who bring up the language of privilege are asking us to consider, is if you're one of those people who have benefited from the way our society has been constructed, are you willing to then take the blessing that you have, the access you have, the status you have, and begin using it for the good of others, realizing you're not going to lose out. You hold a position of privilege. You hold a position of power. You're not losing anything necessarily. You're simply leveling the playing field, pulling people up, extending the position and the power you have to give other people an equal seat at the table. And so I think that's the conversation about privilege. It's to understand, in some senses, all of us have different levels of privilege in different rooms that we enter into, and different organizations we enter into, and different establishments we enter into, because every thing that requires organization starts privileging people and starts marginalizing people. And so we need to figure out where our privileges are and figure out how we can include more people at the table to have equal access to all of the same benefits that we have. I don't know if I articulated that clearly, but
no, it's great. It's great. I mean, it's super big. So yeah, you took a chunk of it and now help me with another chunk. What does it mean though to have like privilege? So if we understand a bit of like how maybe it got there, what is still the thing that we're saying when we're saying that someone possesses a kind of privilege? How does that actually impact their world? Because it doesn't show up on your driver's license, right? It doesn't show up on your degree. It doesn't show up anywhere. Yeah. You don't actually have a thing that you can hold that says I have privilege, but it is it is naming a kind of reality. So help us put language to what is it naming? What does it mean to possess a kind of privilege?
Yeah. Often if you're a person with a lot of privilege, you don't realize why this conversation,
well said. Yeah.
It's why this conversation is so uncomfortable. Again, a few years ago, I was talking in Canada and I made a statement to our lovely Canadian friends. To an audience, I said, all of us are inheritors of racism. It was an entirely white audience. And I remember a man standing up and saying, You can't say that. I am not racist.
Yeah.
That sensibility of somebody who's never had to think through that, of course you're going to react that way. And the same happens with privilege. People, a lot of white folks, including me, when I was initially told, hey, you have white privilege, I was like, well, I grew up poor. I grew up in a family where my dad has a middle school degree, my mom has a high school degree. Like, there was no privilege in my upbringing.
Mm.
But then you start examining the larger story that you're a part of, right? And so, how privilege manifests, an example I give in the book, I was a straight C student throughout all of my education. And yet, when I applied to all of the colleges I applied to, and I got accepted to all of the colleges I applied to, studies have shown that if I had a black sounding name, there's something like, it's like 45% less likely to get accepted to a school than a student with a white sounding name.
With identical
And
transcript.
So, yeah.
Okay.
And so the point is, like, I shouldn't have gotten accepted to a lot of schools I did get accepted to initially. And there were probably people who were more qualified. But anecdotally, because I was white, because I come from a pedigree, I applied to all evangelical institutions for school, by the way. And so even there, like, there's an enhanced level of privilege and bias. I got accepted. And I wouldn't have been aware of that if I never was asked to have some self-reflection, to think about how many people apply to schools every year who are people of color and are not given a fair shot simply because there's implicit bias at work. And people don't realize, they're not conscious of the implicit bias, but the society that we live in has shaped us such that white supremacy is the norm. And so if you're not conscious of white supremacy, you're just going to live it out. And it lives itself out in all of our institutions, not just schools, but in governments and in hiring and in all sorts of different levels of our society. There are these implicit biases, and they perpetuate the division between the privileged class and those who are marginalized so that they can get ahead. So, yeah, one example of how privilege manifests.
No, it's great. I'm wondering, I want to go back. You said, you made the comment that you probably shouldn't have gotten accepted into the college. Can you put some more meat on that bones? Because is that really what you're saying? Is that you should not have been accepted into the college, or is maybe your intent with that, all things being equal, perhaps there were other candidates that were better qualified that would have edged you out? I don't think you're saying that you just shouldn't have gotten in. I think the fuller sentence is maybe in light of if things were being equal and more equitable, perhaps you wouldn't have gotten in.
Yeah. I think what I'm saying is, based on the set of academic skills I was bringing at the time, I'm grateful I got in. And it is likely, based on statistics, that there were other people who were not white or who didn't come from the same sort of religious background that I came from, that probably were more qualified or more worthy based on GPA, based on academic performance to get in. I think it's, of course, this is something I will never know, but just looking at the studies of how higher education has worked in America until recently, that's just true. If you're white, you're going to get in far more often than somebody who is not white or doesn't have a white sounding name. Thankfully, things like Title IX are now a thing, and there affirmative action. There are all sorts of things that are working to make these systems no longer work in quite the privileging way that they have in the past. But when I was applying to school, certainly these things statistically were still at work in higher education.
Yeah. So even when you say, like, kind of based on your personal transcripts and what you were bringing to the table, even in that sense, though, what was coming up for me is there is a kind of privileging of those who are already good at the school system as it is. So the school system as it is, privileges or favors people who whose minds work in a certain kind of way, whose bodies can sit in a desk for a certain amount of time, whose memories can remember factoids to put on a test, and whose neurological systems don't panic when they're timed, because for some reason in our country, we've decided that not only do you have to know the answers, you have to know them really quickly. You have a limited amount of time to know the answers. And so people who get good grades are often people who just happen to have the sort of wiring and mentality and physiological makeup that works well in our system. So I guess I'm even pushing back a little bit on like
Please.
saying that maybe you shouldn't have gotten in based on your transcripts. But even if you're to peel that back, it's like, well, maybe it's really good that there was an allowance of.
Yeah.
What am I trying to say? Like there's some version of that story that's like, maybe with some parameters, this student shouldn't have gotten in. But if we're wanting to evaluate all of the systems that are in our education, one of those is we can't just keep saying only the people who are already good at this system get to keep going on in the system.
Right.
Anyways, it sounds like I'm arguing with you and like disagreeing, by the way. Like everybody who's followed me knows that I've been talking about writing about privilege for years as well. So I'm not anti-privilege, but I'm finding the more you sort of peel back the layers, the more it's just, there's a lot going on there. Yeah.
No, totally. And I think what you're doing is exactly right. Like I'm speaking, so that example works in the lens of white privilege. It works in the lens of talking about race. But this kind of harkens back to another book, True Inclusion, where I really challenge people to think exactly how you're thinking. Like, it's not just these couple hot button issues of race, sexuality, gender that are the issues. There are tons of ways that people are privileged in society over other people. And there are, like, the education system was created by a certain kind of people from a certain part of the world where this is how education worked. And so that sort of education is the education that has been normalized and thus privileged. If you can play at that education system, you get ahead. If you can't, you don't. And so I think you're exactly right to say the conversation of privilege should take us to explore all of these different aspects of our life, all of these aspects of our identities, and ask, where are we blessed? Where can we get ahead? Where have we been given a leg up? And how might we help those who don't function in that same way or don't have access to that same privilege get ahead with us?
Yeah, because there's a version of that same story of yours. Now, I happen to sort of share your opinion, which is because it was an evangelical institution. What I'm about to say is probably not how the story went, but there's a version of that story that could be, you can imagine a good faith argument would be there's an admissions group that is made up of a significant chunk of diversity representing all sorts of identity markers and all sorts of, demographics. There's a version of that story that's like, look, we need to make sure that we are that some percentage of our incoming class are kids who really struggled academically in high school, but are super motivated and could potentially succeed in a different environment. And maybe that's how you got in, and it had nothing to do. Maybe the names were redacted. Maybe, right. The race was redacted. Like all of that's redacted. And maybe it was just for that day. It was let's find 13 applicants that, can help round this out. Anyway, again, because I know the institution you went to, that's probably not what happened. I think you were favored perhaps because of some other demographics, but anyway.
You're exactly right. I think thankfully that is how most admission processes happen or need to happen in 2022. I think that is a result of people raising this conversation, especially in higher education, and saying, we've got to do better. So
that's good.
Yeah.
Okay, let's go back to one of the themes in your book. You talk about this passage of this passage in Philippians, and this the sort of seeing Jesus's life and then giving up of life as kind of this pattern of being filled with a kind of privilege so that you could empty it. But then you also said a few minutes ago, to the person who might be coming to awareness or waking up to their own privilege, that the invitation in part is to ensure that others, I forget how you phrased it, like give that away for the benefit of others. And then you made the comment, because you're not losing anything. Like you still have the privilege and the power. You're not losing anything. And yet if we follow the Jesus pattern, you kind of are losing something. So I'm hoping you can go back and flesh that out when you say to a person like myself who has a shit ton of privilege, and the invitation / challenge to use that in ways that benefit others. It is somehow both true and not true that I am not losing anything, I think. So I'm wondering if you can say more about what you meant by that.
Yeah. Well, so the thing about the Jesus story and the crucifixion narrative from a traditional Christian perspective, and that's how I think you have to interpret Philippians chapter 2 in some ways, because there's some traditional Christian theology at work in the writing of Philippians 2. So you're assuming Jesus is God incarnate. You're assuming Jesus has all of the divine power. Like, that is the narrative that the writer of Philippians chapter 2 is conveying. And so I'm using that as the model. We're assuming that as the model, that you have Jesus who at no point stops being God, at no point stops in traditional kenotic theology having access to divine power, but rather uses it in his life and ministry, never for his own benefit. When Jesus is healing, he's not healing himself. When Jesus is multiplying bread and loaf, fish and loaves, he's doing that for other people. It's always extending his power and his divine ability for the good of others. And so if we're using that, which I would say is mythological, but if that is the mythological frame that we're working from, the call is to say, you have a lot of blessing, you have a lot of privilege, you have a lot of access in your world. How are you using that?
Yeah.
Is it, the Christian message is not to use that for your own benefit, not to function in the evolutionary conditioning that we all have of scarcity, where we need to protect us and our tribe, otherwise we're going to lose, we're going to die. That's the evolutionary fear we're all functioning within. Christ calls us out of that, to give up that fear and to always be looking to others, to always look at our neighbor and even our enemy first. And so the question is, what does your neighbor need that you have? And in giving it up, the subversive truth within the Christian message is, in giving you receive, and dying you're born to eternal life. You're not actually ultimately losing. As the playing field becomes leveled, as the mountains are
that's good.
Turned to valleys and the valleys are exalted, it feels like loss.
Feels like a loss.
But when you look around, you're standing on the same ground.
That's good, Brandon. That's good. I really like that a lot. This is great. Ben says, this is such a great conversation. I feel equipped with better language to discuss privilege with those who still aren't grappling or getting it yet. And then I want to go back to Melissa. I see your comment. Melissa says, talking about the educational component, she said, yeah, and it seemed that my privileges helped to hide my neurodiversity all through schooling as a student as well as an educator. So that's a good perspective too. I really like that a lot, Brandon, that it feels like there's a loss. But is there a way that we can say, and you talk about this in your book, how America is a sort of a uniquely shaped and designed for people like ourselves, Enneagram type 3s, right? Where it's about success and doing and gain and more and acquisition and performance and all that. So it can feel like a loss. And in some ways it might actually be a kind of loss.
Yeah.
Right? I don't want to minimize that reality, that there, not only does it seem like a loss, but then there actually is some losses that might come. It sounds like what you're arguing is there might be, though, down the road, a way in which you see that loss is a gain. So this is probably a bad example I'm about to give. So you just tell me why it's a bad example when I'm done. Because it sets me up as the hero, and I don't mean to be the hero of this story. It's just my own personal story. But when I was fired from the church in Arizona for having a theology of inclusion, there was real losses, right? There was. I mean, I lost my job. We lost our home, lost financial solvency that, 12 years later, we're still climbing out of. So those losses are real. Now, I don't want to frame that whole story as me like being some privileged person that leveraged all that for the marginalized. That's not the point of the story, as much as there is a cost that can and probably will be paid when asking people with privileges to begin to lay some of those down or use those for the benefit of others. What it sounds like you're saying is though that might be a kind of loss, there is also a kind of gain. And that is 100% what I can also testify to is the financial loss, all that loss, the gains in my own life, emotionally, spiritually, all the gains are far outweigh that I could not have seen 12 years ago. But the losses are kind of real.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And I think what this book actually became was this. I started off trying to write this just about privilege, and it's actually more of a manual on how I think we should follow Jesus in a modern world. And so I think this conversation about privilege, like there's the justice side of this, and then there's also a spiritual side of this.
Okay,
And
I like where you're going.
I'm melding both of those, right?
Uh-huh.
But at the same time, I think the privilege conversation also, like in the book, I keep it, when we're talking about the justice side of it, I do keep it pretty high level, like talking about systemic privilege. And I think that's very different when you get down to the individual level. There are going to be things people need to give up. And my invitation is, if you want to follow Jesus, if you're actually following Jesus, that's what you signed up for, right? This is a book for Christians in particular. It's like, yes, of course it's going to hurt. He says you're going to get crucified, and however you want to interpret that, like that's the game we're playing.
I think, Brandon, if I can interrupt only to add to that, I think that's part of the Christianity of progressive Christianity that a lot of progressives wish wasn't the case anymore.
Yeah.
I found that in my own life, and I found that in sort of my preaching and leading with some of my community is there's this desire within progressive Christianity to bring some of the Christianity with us, leave a lot behind that needs to. But one of the things we don't like, maybe a lot of us, is the pattern of Jesus dying to self. There's a lot of listen to me now. Hang on now, people. There's a lot of necessary work to be done in self-love. 100%. Especially for people that have maybe less privilege or more marginalized, and especially for women, because in the evangelical world, it's like women, your whole narrative is that you don't exist for anything other than the helping and the benefiting of your male counterpart. So your only job is to die to yourself. And like that's twisted in a really negative way. So then on the other side of that, there's a lot like, you need to learn to love yourself. But I found sometimes on the other side of that, it can be hard to then get back into now what does it look like to die to self again? Like once you have a self, how do you die to that self again? Because that seems to be the way of Jesus, which you don't have to agree with, which is really like what you were saying, like that's kind of what you signed up for. That is in part what it means to be a follower of Christ, is to be someone who lays down their life for the sake of the other. But that can be a really scary, vulnerable, and in some ways the wrong advice to give some people at some stages of their life.
Yeah, no, I think you're exactly right. And there's a whole chapter where I kind of go into the spirituality of kenosis and like laying down for the good of others. This is what every spiritual tradition, virtually every tradition, even non-Christian traditions, I quote Cynthia Bourgeault, who talks about Buddhist traditions and other, like at the core level of, at the mystic level of all spiritual traditions, there is this call to give up an ego self in order to step into a true self. And I'm with you. Like it's a very precise conversation, but I will say, like, identities are all important. All of these external identities we have, they are vital, and it's in the realm of identity where privilege happens in society. The call of Jesus is to get past, at some level, these identities to recognize the common humanity in all of us. And there's this balance of doing the work on the external side of things, where you're asking, my outward identities, where am I privileged or where am I marginalized? And how do I deal with that in the world? If I'm a Christian and I'm privileged, how do I give up for the good of the marginalized? If I'm marginalized, how do I ensure that I have an equal seat at the table? But at the spiritual level, we're all being called to the same thing. And there is a sense where we need to detach from these external identities in order to come see the common humanity in all people. And from that space, true transformation can take place, both socially and spiritually, when we get to see that even folks who we see as our enemies actually are participating in the same common humanity that we have. That's where true healing can actually occur. But it takes a lot of work, and there's a lot of caveats there. And I think that's what I try to parlay out in this
Yeah.
book is
Yeah.
the complexity of what it means to follow Jesus, which
Yeah.
is to deal with social realities and to believe the spiritual reality that Jesus tried to embody in his life and teachings.
Yeah. That's well said. All right. I've got one last thing to throw your way and then I'll let you go.
Yeah.
One of the things that I've come up against in my work and some conversations and reflections and study on the topic of privilege is there's what I would call a diversity of thought with regards to how a person ought use and or steward their privilege. And so there are some lines of thinking that I do not begrudge because it makes sense to me, and yet I do not necessarily hold it for myself. There's some lines of thinking that if a person has any sort of privilege, the only thing they should do with it is to completely like remove themselves from any position of power, any position of influence, like basically just get out of the way entirely to make space for less privileged. So that might be one sort of extreme. I don't even know if it's extreme, but it's on one end of the spectrum that I'm about to lay out. Whereas maybe another perspective is a more stewarding of privilege, of saying, how can I leverage this influence? How can I leverage these resources, this power that I might possess to better tip the scales, for, as you talk about in the book, for the sake of others. So and those are just 2 points on a grid of varying degrees of how people interact with the sort of, okay, now what then should you do? Because it's one thing to have an awareness of privilege. It's one thing to learn about it. It's one thing to be educated about it. It's one thing to wake up to it, to get past that point of the guy in the church in Canada who's like, that's not me. It's one point to be like, oh no, it me on a number of levels. That's one move. But then the so whatness of it, okay, what do you actually do with it? That's where I found a pretty broad range of ideas. And sometimes, and I'm sure you can agree to this, sometimes they don't play well with each other. Sometimes these perspectives don't like how other people sort of think like there's just one way that you should use this privilege. And that can get really dicey. So I don't know, what are your thoughts on kind of the diversity of differing perspectives on this?
Yeah. The one thing I've learned is that when we're talking about any of these ethical or social questions, that you got to stay away from the extremes. You got to stay away from saying one way or the other way. You've got to always nuance it with both ways or a multitude of ways. And so there are circumstances where a person of privilege should step aside and say, hey, another person can step up and do this, or another person might have opportunity. And there are other moments in life where that a person of privilege is going to be invited to use their gifts, talents, like whatever it might be, to step into a space and utilize those. I don't think it's one or the other. I think it's a both and. And I think our society is getting pulled apart by our binary drive right now to say it has to be this or it has to be
That's
that.
right. Yeah.
I think in each of us, we're going to be called to do both at different times. And the call of Jesus is to be willing to do whatever in the moment you're being called to do, whether that is to give something up for somebody else to have it, or to use your position of power and privilege to make space at a table that person might never have a chance to get to without you making space. So it's nuanced, it's complex, and I just want to invite us all to resist any moment of when we feel like we need to be pulled to one side or the other when we're talking about ethics.
It's good.
Let's leave the nuance.
It's good. It's good, man. Thank you, Brandan, for being on the show. Thank you for sharing with us some of the things. These are just scratching the surface, friends, I tell you, on the things that Brandan has made in the world. You're one of my favorite makers. I'm really proud of you for the work that you do. I love this book. I invite people to go check it out, To Be Emptied. I think it's a necessary book especially for those like myself who do possess a lot of layers of privilege and have influence and have resources and have like, this is a book for me. You wrote it for me. I don't know if you meant to, but you wrote it for me and I'm grateful for it. So,
wow. Thank you so much. And thank you for cultivating space and conversations for things like this. I really appreciate you and what you do in the world.
My pleasure. All right, buddy. Till next time. Thanks, Brandan.
Yes.
Bye. All right, friends. That is my friend Brandan. Please go check out. I put the link up there earlier for his Metanoia online church if you're looking for something to do on Sunday mornings. And then check out his new book, Filled to Be Emptied. Fantastic. You're going to love it. Coming up on the altar, all the rest of March, we're going to have more makers. And I can't wait to introduce some people to you that you might not know and then bring on some friends that you might know and love already. Can't wait to have great conversations with them. All right. That's all I've got for today, friends. So grateful for you when you hang out with me. I'm so grateful for you when you watch this back later because you can't make it live. I'm just grateful for you. My heart fills up with gratitude when I think about this space and this thing we get to do together. All right. I love you all. Have a good week. Bye.